Before we proceed with the discussion that's related with the sample problem number 4, let's simply settle the discussion that's related with another mode of inheritance known as the incomplete dominance. Now, when it comes to the incomplete dominance, it is now the mixture of the different traits and characteristics that is actually present on different genes. So basically, we have here the presence of the best example for the incomplete dominance that is now actually present on the hair of humans. So, when it comes to the hair texture, there are actually two main types of genotypes that are actually present. The presence of curly hair gene and straight hair gene. Now, this curly hair gene will actually be manifested on an individual if that is now present in homozygous dominant curly hair gene. While when it comes to the straight hair gene, it would now be manifested as straight hair if there is now the presence of the homozygous dominant if there is now the presence of homozygous for the certain type of gene. But please take note that the curly hair gene it is more dominant and the straight hair gene it is now recessive. So whenever there would be the presence of different types of hair texture that would be present on different individuals, always remember that for you to manifest curly hair gene, it should be equivalent to homozygous dominant for curly hair gene, while when it comes to the straight hair gene, it should now be manifested as homozygous recessive straight hair gene. Now, when it comes to the incomplete dominance, there is actually the presence of mixture of the different traits that would be present on every single one of them. Okay? So, the mixture of curly hair and straight hair would actually give us the intermediate of the hair texture that is present on curly and straight hair gene. And that is the presence of wavy hair. Okay? So please take note, the reason why we are using this certain type of symbolism, capital letter H, it is now equivalent for the hair. Since this is now the trait that is actually present, then the presence of capital letter C that would now be equated to curly, while capital letter S, it would now equate to straight. Okay, so we are not using here the same representations that are done when it comes to complete dominance. Okay? According to problem number 4, a couple have the following traits. Curly hair with counterclockwise whirl and has no widow's peak. Wavy hair, clockwise whirl and has widow's peak. Both are heterozygous. What will be the chances that they will have an offspring with A. Straight hair with no widow's peak, B. Curly hair with widow's peak and clockwise whirl, and C. Wavy hair without widow's peak and counterclockwise whirl. Okay, so the very first thing that we are going to settle here, what would be the genotype of the parents, okay? The first parent, we have here the presence of the genotype that is equivalent to curly hair, then the presence of counterclockwise whirl, and the presence of no widow's peak, or rather the absence of widow's peak. Then for the second parent, it is now the presence of wavy hair. Remember that wavy hair, it is now the combination not only of the phenotype but also of the genotype of the curly hair gene and the straight hair gene. Then the presence of clockwise whirl, which is in heterozygous, and the presence of widow's peak, which is also in heterozygous. Then, if we're going to do the segregation and law of independent assortment, we're going to arrive with the following for the different traits that are present on these parents. The first set of trait, it is now the presence of the hair texture, then the presence of the whirl, and the third one, it is now the presence of widow's peak. So, let's simply focus first on the hair texture. So, we have here the presence of curly hair, then you're going to multiply this with the presence of the genotype for wavy hair, which would actually give us 1/2 or 2 out of 4 homozygous dominant curly hair and 1/2 heterozygous dominant, or basically the presence now of incomplete dominance of curly hair and straight hair, which would now provide wavy hair when it comes to its phenotype. Okay? So even though if you're going to do the full method when it comes to this particular case, you're going to arrive with the same answer. Okay? Then, for the second trait, we now have here the presence of the whorl, homozygous recessive, then heterozygous dominant, which would now give us 1/2 clockwise whorl, 1/2 counterclockwise whorl. Then, when it comes to the widow's peak, it is still the same case, just like what is present on the whorl, which would now give us the 1/2 presence of widow's peak and 1/2 absence of widow's peak. So these are now the different summaries that we can actually use for us to solve the problems that are related in this question. Now let's solve for letter A. According to letter A, it is now the presence of the straight hair and the presence of no widow's peak. So, if we're going to consider now the probability that is actually present here on the table that we created, is there now any chance that this couple would have an offspring possessing straight hair? Since there is now the absence of the probability for these parents to have straight-haired offspring, we're going to write here 0 out of 4 or 0% or 0 out of 2. Because, once again, there would be no chances that they would possess an offspring having this certain type of allele. Then, we're going to multiply this with the presence of this second trait, which is now the absence of widow's peak, which is equivalent to 1/2, if you can still remember on the table that we created. Then, we're going to multiply this with 100, and our answer, that would be equivalent to 0%. We can actually answer here 0% since 0% is still equivalent to a probability. Now, for letter B. For letter B, it states here the presence of the curly hair, then widow's peak, and lastly, the presence of clockwise whorl. Okay? So, now the probability for the offspring to have curly hair, it is equivalent to 1/2. Then the probability for it to have widow's peak, it is equivalent also to 1/2. And for it to have a clockwise whorl, it is also equivalent to 1/2. Then we're going to multiply this with 100, in which we're going to arrive with the answer that is equivalent to 1/8 times 100, which is also equivalent to 12.5%. Okay? So when it comes to the certain types of traits, we're just going to multiply them, and then we're going to arrive with our answer. And lastly, for letter C, it is not the presence of wavy hair, then without widow's peak, and lastly, the presence of the counterclockwise whorl. Okay, the presence of wavy hair, it is now equivalent to a probability of 1/2. Then the presence of the absence rather of widow's peak, it is also equivalent to 1/2. And the presence of counterclockwise whorl, it is also equivalent to 1/2. Then we're going to multiply these values with 100. Then we're going to arrive with 1/8 times 100, which is also equivalent to 12.5%. Okay, so hopefully you can now see the pattern when it comes to answering different problems that is related with genetic probability. Always remember, for your job to be easier, you should create first a table or summarize first the different characteristics that are now present on the different phenotypes that would be manifested by the parents, then to their offspring, then answer these particular problems utilizing now the data that you gathered. Okay, so now before we proceed with sample problem number 5, let's now consider here another type of mode of inheritance. If we already discussed the presence of complete dominance and the presence of incomplete dominance, now let's talk about the presence of codominance. And the best example of codominance when it comes to humans, it is not the presence of blood types. Now, there are actually two types of dominant genes that are actually present when it comes to humans. It is now the presence of type A gene, which is now the presence of the sugar known as galactosamine, or it is now a type of galactose that is possessing now an amine functional group that is present on our red blood cells, while the other one, the other type of codominant trait, it is now the presence of the type B gene, which is now possessing here the sugar known as galactose. While the recessive gene, it is now the absence of the sugar, galactosamine or galactose. So, it is known as codominance because these different types of genes can actually co-inhabitate on any individuals possessing the same types of dominant genes. And the presence of these different types of genes could actually determine what would be our blood types. So, for instance, if you are a blood type A person, you are possessing here the type A gene either in homozygous, which is now one coming from your father, the other one is coming from your mother, both of which are type A gene, or it could also be manifested as heterozygous. If one of your parents are possessing type A gene, while the other parent is possessing either heterozygous or the recessive gene. Okay? Then, for blood type B, the same case as blood type A. It is now the presence of either homozygous dominant blood type B or heterozygous dominant blood type B, both of which would still manifest this certain type of blood type because the sugar that is present on your body for blood type A, it is now the presence of galactosamine for your red blood cells, while for blood type B, it is now the presence of galactose. Then, when it comes to blood type O, since it is just the presence of the absence of sugar, it is present in homozygous recessive trait. Okay? So basically, blood type O is not actually letter O, but rather it is the number 0. It is just utilized in the medical field as another letter since we are utilizing here the AB blood typing system when it comes to the basic blood types that are present in the planet, specifically on our species for the Homo sapiens sapiens. Then, whenever blood type A gene and type B gene coexisted or present in an individual, both of these characteristics would actually be present. So, that is the reason why this human would actually possess blood type AB, since it is now possessing type A gene, which is now possessing the sugar known as galactosamine, then blood type B or type B gene, which is now possessing the galactose sugar. So, for the people possessing blood type AB, you're actually having here the presence of both galactosamine and galactose sugar on the coating of the red blood cells. According to problem number 5, you are a blood type B individual. Okay, so your blood type is B. Okay? And you married someone possessing a blood type that is a B. You found out that your parents are possessing the following genotypes. One of your parent is possessing blood type AB, while your other parent is possessing blood type O. Now, when it comes to these particular problems, the first one, what is your genotype? Since the genotype of her blood isn't actually given when it comes to this particular case, let's now consider here doing test cross for us to determine what would be the possible genotype of your blood type, since your blood type, since it is blood type B, could actually either be homozygous dominant blood type B or heterozygous dominant blood type B. Okay? Now, according to this problem, your parents, they are possessing the blood type AB and blood type O. If we're going to consider the genotype of blood type AB, we can determine here the presence of the codominance of blood type A and type B. Then, your other parent, it is homozygous recessive for the blood type. Then, if you're going to have a test cross using the FOIL method, we're actually going to arrive with heterozygous dominant A, heterozygous dominant B, heterozygous dominant A, and heterozygous dominant B. So basically, your parents could only have offspring possessing blood types A or blood type B, which are possessing the genotypes of heterozygous dominant and heterozygous dominant B. So, and with this information, we can now determine here that your blood type is possessing the genotype of heterozygous dominant B. Since this is now once again the different traits that are actually present on your parents. Okay? While your partner, he or she is now possessing codominance of blood type A and blood type B. Now let's proceed with problem letter B. According to problem letter B, what would be the chances that your child would have the same blood type as you? Okay? For us to determine this answer, we are going to do test cross, in which we're going to cross your genotype with the genotype of your partner. Okay? And if we're going to do now the test cross, first one, we're going to have blood type AB. Then the next one is now the presence of blood type B, which is homozygous dominant. Then the next one, it is now the presence of blood type A, that is heterozygous dominant, and the presence of blood type B, which is heterozygous dominant. Okay? Now, what would be the probability that your offspring would have the same blood type as you? According here, we are simply considering here the phenotype of the blood type. Okay? So it simply means that would possess the same blood type B as you. Okay? We are not talking about the genotype. We are talking about the phenotype here. So we have here the summary that is equivalent to 1/4 blood type AB. Then the presence of another 1/4, which is blood type A. Then we have here the presence of 1/4 homozygous dominant B and the 1/4 heterozygous dominant B. Since we are talking about phenotypes here, we are now going to combine these values, in which we're going to arrive with 1/2 for blood type B. Since you are blood type B also, the probability that your offspring would possess blood type B, you're going to multiply 1/2 with 100. You will now be having here 50% probability that your offspring would have the same blood type as you. Okay? So that would be for letter B. For letter C, the problem here states that what would be the chances that your child would possess the same blood type as your partner. So your partner, she is now possessing, or he is now possessing blood type AB. So the probability that your offspring would have the same blood type as your partner is equivalent only to 1/4, or 1/4 times 100, which it will now give us 25%. So now, before we proceed with sample problem number 6, let's now discuss here the presence and the abundance of the different traits that are now related with our sex genes or our sex chromosomes. Now, when it comes to the sex-linked chromosomes, it is now actually the different traits that are present on those certain types of chromosomes that are present on the 23rd pair. So remember that when it comes to the sex that is present among humans, it is actually being determined by the 23rd pair of our chromosome. It would either be the presence of 2 X's for the females and an X and a Y when it comes to males. Now, when it comes to the different types of sex-linked traits, we actually have here 2 main types. We have the presence of the X-dominant trait, and you also have the presence of X-recessive trait. Now, when it comes to the different things that are actually being manifested by the different characteristics that are present here, we can actually summarize the occurrence and the probability of these different types of diseases to be passed from one generation to another based on the following. So for instance, if that trait is an example of an X-dominant trait, if that is a female, for that female to be positive, she should possess homozygous dominant for this X-dominant trait. For instance, the condition known as hypertrichosis or the Wolfman syndrome, that is actually an example of an X-dominant trait. Then, females would manifest this certain type of characteristic if it is now present on their gene on homozygous dominant. Okay? While females would be carrier of the hypertrichosis gene if it is now in the form of heterozygous dominant. Then, the female would be negative if they are now possessing homozygous recessive for the absence of that gene. Okay? That's the thing about females. There are three possibilities. It would either be positive, carrier, or negative. But when it comes to males, it is just binary, in which males would either be positive or would be negative. If that would be an X-dominant trait, that person should possess the genotype for X-dominant for him to have a positive presence of this certain type of condition, just like what I mentioned earlier, the presence of hypertrichosis. Then, for that man to be negative, he should possess the recessive trait for that, or the recessive gene for that X-dominant trait. Then, if that condition is an example of an X-recessive, for instance, the presence of hemophilia or the bleeder's disease, for the female to be negative, she should possess the homozygous dominant for that gene, while for a female to be a carrier, heterozygous dominant for that gene because there is now the presence of the X-recessive trait. Okay, remember that the recessive trait would carry the manifestation of hemophilia. So females would be carrier if the presence of that recessive X gene is present on her 23rd chromosome. Then, we also have here the presence of positive female with hemophilia, which is now possessing the presence of X recessive, which is in homozygous. Then for males, just like what I mentioned earlier, they would be in binary since males only possess one X chromosome. Okay? So, it is now the male would now be negative if he is possessing the dominant gene for hemophilia, while if he is now possessing the recessive gene for hemophilia or positive for hemophilia, he would be positive to this certain type of condition. Okay, so remember that when it comes to the presence of different types of sex-linked genes, they're always related with letter X. The reason why for males it would always be binary because they only possess one X, while in the case of females, they would either be positive, negative, or carrier depending upon the location and the presence of those genes on their X's. Now, when it comes to the genotype that is present on both Troy and Sia, according to this problem, Troy, who has hemophilia, O blood type, and without widow's peak, this would be his genotype. Okay, remember that since Troy is male, he is now possessing here the 23rd chromosome that is X and the Y. On the X chromosome, it is now the presence of the hemophilia gene. Okay, that is why it is manifested in this manner. While in the case of Sia, since Sia, she is a carrier of the hemophilia gene, she would now be possessing heterozygous dominant for hemophilia. Then, heterozygous dominant for blood type B, and heterozygous dominant also for the presence of widow's peak. So, that's the thing about the different characteristics that are now present in this couple. Then, the breakdown. If we're going to do the test cross or the full method when it comes to the hemophilia, we're actually going to arrive with the following. 1/4 would be a female carrier, 1/4 probability that the female would be positive, 1/4 would be the probability that a male would be negative, and 1/4 that the probability of the male would be positive to hemophilia. Remember, since this is an example of a recessive X gene, we are going to consider the following. Okay? Then, for blood type, for Troy, it is blood type O. Then for Sia, it is now blood type B, on which we're going to have the probability of 1/2 blood type B and 1/2 blood type O. Then for the widow's peak, we have the presence of the homozygous recessive, absence of widow's peak, and heterozygous dominant with the presence of the widow's peak, which would give us 1/2 probability of the presence of widow's peak and 1/2 probability for the absence of widow's peak. Now let's answer the question for letter A. According to letter A, we are now asking here the presence of the probability for a boy to have hemophilia. Okay? Since we now have here the presence of the FOIL method answers that we had summarized earlier, we can now determine here that the probability that Troy would have a son possessing hemophilia is now equivalent to 1/4, or this is also equivalent to 25%. That is a probability that he would have a son possessing 1/4, or he would now be possessing a son possessing hemophilia. So that is for letter A. Then for letter B, the question here, it is now a female positive to hemophilia, the presence of blood type O, and widow's peak. There would be 1/4 chance that they would have an offspring possessing hemophilia, which is a female. Then, for blood type O, it is now equivalent to 1/2. In the presence of widow's peak, it is also equivalent to 1/2. Then, you're actually going to arrive with the answer that is equivalent to 1/16 times 100, which would now give us the answer of 6.25%. So for letter B, the probability that Troy and Sia would have a female offspring which is positive to hemophilia, possessing blood type O, and has widow's peak is equivalent to 6.25%, or 1 in every 16 chances. Okay, so that is for letter B. Now, let's proceed with letter C. For letter C, the question here, the probability that they would have an offspring which is a boy that is negative to hemophilia, possessing blood type B, and without widow's peak. Now, let's compute for the probability. A male which is negative to hemophilia, it is equivalent to 1/4 probability, times an offspring possessing blood type B, that is also equivalent to 1/2 probability. Then absence of widow's peak, it is now equivalent to 1/2 probability. Then we're going to multiply this with 100, in which we're going to arrive with 1/16 times 100, which is also equivalent to a probability of 6.25%. As you can see, when it comes to the probability that would be related with the sex link, we are going to consider here if that child is either positive, or the child would be negative, or if the child would be a carrier in the case of females.